Thank you very much. It's great to be back. I was with you last year, and I think we did 3 sessions on the Psalms. And we will have a little bit of Psalms tonight, but we're going to be looking more broadly at all of the Bible tonight. And I don't know how much fun this is going to be, because look at the title. The title is taken from one of my favorite Psalms, which we are going to encounter in a little bit. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime, which is what the psalmist prays to God about the psalmist's enemies. And the subtitle, Pastoral Perspectives on Divine and Human Violence in the Bible. I think it's a very timely topic, unfortunately, and it also illustrates a very important point about the Bible, and that is that just like people, like you and me, the Bible has a personality, okay? We all have personalities, and I'm sure if you asked your significant other or your children or your neighbor to describe you, they could give you an overview of what that personality is. But we very rarely think about the Bible as having a personality. But as Dana Fuel notes, she teaches at Drew Theological Seminary, she says that the Bible's own narrative practices are sometimes irritatingly like our own. It suppresses information that would detract from its main points. How many of us bracket out some things that we think are derailing the point that we want to make about us? Sometimes the Bible looks away from troubling details. How often have we done that? Often the Bible overgeneralizes. And the Bible exhibits a tendency to be self-centered and narrowly focused on Israel and its heroes. And of course, there are times in our lives when we have experienced ourselves as being self-centered. So in short, we can say, like us, the Bible has a personality. More accurately, however, the Bible has multiple personalities. You cannot say the Bible is one thing. There are so many strands of tradition from so many different groups over such a long period of time, reflecting on the experience of God, that we can speak of multiple personalities in the Bible. And our job as interpreters of the Bible is to wrestle with those personalities and also talk about those personalities with one another. And sometimes the Bible's personality triggers things within our own personalities that we don't even recognize. So I think our 2 sessions together are going to do a lot of provoking of our unexamined assumptions about who we are and about what the Bible says. And we're going to be hopefully very conscious about what we're doing in that process. So we are now going to encounter this multiple personality Bible that says some disturbing things about violence. Now, I've done some work on this with my colleague Michael Koppel, who teaches pastoral care and counseling and congregational care at the seminary. You ought to have him for one of these sessions because he's really good, and we co-wrote a book together called Grounded in the Living Word. And some of this work that I'm presenting comes from the work I've done jointly with Michael. And we were intentionally cross-disciplinary, a Bible scholar and a pastoral care and counseling scholar, together talking about what does all this mean that we're studying in the Bible for the way we live our lives, for our relationships with one another in community. So I have been told, and Michael has been told, that our work on violence is a very timely subject. And we can be sad about that. I wish it weren't timely. I wish we didn't have to deal with violence. And I have to say, despite having gone to Vanderbilt to get a PhD, spent 8 years in Nashville, and hating country music the whole time I was there, once I left, I have fallen in love with country music because it's really changed. So what do I hear on the way over but Carrie Underwood's, I carved my name into his leather seats, took a Louisville Slugger to both headlights, and I'm thinking, whoa, there's violence that we all sing along to. And then there's another, I think it's Brantley Gilbert, Redneck Crazy. You broke the wrong heart, baby, and I'm going to park my truck in your driveway and shine my lights into your bedroom and throw beer cans at your window. And oh my goodness. So we sing about violence. And unfortunately, a lot of some rap music, a lot of rap music is filled with violence. I just heard Eric Clapton singing about I Shot the Sheriff. I mean, he's a classic, wonderful guitarist, but, I shot the sheriff and I didn't shoot his deputy. Okay, what are we singing about? Okay, so we sing about violence. It's in the newspapers. It's just splattered over the electronic media. Yet at the same time, being constantly exposed to it and immediately exposed to it, we become desensitized by it. We become desensitized. So let's look at how we define violence, and I want to give you a very simple definition. There are other definitions out there, but I want to keep it simple. Anything that violates what the Bible calls the shalom of a person or of a community is violence, and shalom would be wholeness and well-being, okay? In other words, shalom would be what God intends for our life to be in all of its fullness. And anything that gets in the way of that is violence. Unfortunately, when we turn to the Bible, we don't need to look hard to find violence because it can easily be found in both testaments. Don't think that because Jesus came, violence is no longer a problem, and we're going to look at that in a minute. And the violence is carried out not only by human beings, but by God. And that's really tough to wrap our heads around. So before we start looking at any of these texts, let me ask you, when you think of the Bible, what violent texts or stories come to mind for you? Cain and Abel, the first murder, right? Chapter 4, only 4 chapters into the entire Bible, what do we get? The first murder. Okay? Cain kills his brother Abel because he's pouting because God did not accept Cain's sacrifice. Okay? Yeah, what else? Noah. Okay, the flood, yes? We're going to talk about that at some length tonight. The flood. How many of you, and I'm guilty of this, have a picture of Noah's Ark or a model of Noah's Ark or gave it to your kids or your grandkids or your neighbors? How many? I've got one still outside of my kids' rooms. Now they're all moved out. But yeah, a beautiful silk screen of Noah's Ark with the animals 2x2. Yeah. So our popular take on that story is what? It's all warm and fuzzy, right? But there's a flip side that we want to look at. Okay? What other violent stories come to mind?
Israel entering the Promised Land.
Thank you. Israel entering the Promised Land, the conquest of Canaan. In the books of Joshua and Judges, the whole concept of holy war, right? Is that what you were going to say? Is it?
We were going to say Passover, like the killing of the firstborn.
Oh, the 10th plague. The 10th plague, the killing of the firstborn in Egypt. Yeah, which I have to remind us, because Pesach will be coming up this spring. Pesach is the Hebrew for Passover. During that, if any of you have been to a Passover Seder, when it comes to the telling of that story, there's no joy in that. That's a very solemn moment in the Seder and the telling of the story because God does not rejoice in the killing of the firstborn. Okay, but nonetheless, very violent. Yes. That's putting the whole city under what's called the ban. In Hebrew, the word for that is cherem. Can you all say cherem? Cherem. Oh, very good Hebrew. Tov ma'od. And it's basically utterly destroying everything in the city. Why? There are different reasons given, because anything that comes from a culture that worships another god is going to pollute Israel's worship. Carol Myers, an archaeologist, said it really has to do with plague control. You're killing everything and burning it so as not to spread disease. Okay, I mean, there are different approaches to this, but nonetheless, it's very violent. And animals and crops, I mean, these are things that people need for human thriving, yeah. Everybody's really good about Hebrew Bible. Anything occur to you in New Testament, or do you think that's off limits?
Crucifixion.
Thank you. The crucifixion. Mary Daly, one of the early feminists, called the crucifixion divine child abuse. You may not agree, but it is the flip side. I mean, Jesus died a very violent death. Okay? And you can say, well, he was older and he accepted it, but nonetheless, it was a very violent event, yes? Anything else in the New Testament? What? Revelation. Thank you very much. We end the Bible with a kind of, I would say, a cosmic violence, okay? And we're going to talk about that. Does everybody get to live in the heavenly Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem? No, only those washed in the blood of the Lamb. And the other people are literally burned in the fires, okay? There are tons more examples in the New Testament of violence that we kind of gloss over, particularly because we talk about Jesus as the one who models and lives peace, yes? But there again, there's our personality. We avoid what gets in the way of our main point, yeah? Okay, so there's violence there committed by human beings, but then we have to ask who's committing the violence in the book of Revelation? Who's creating the lakes of fire into which the wicked are thrown? It's God, okay? So my point is, and it will become more clear as we go through specific passages, is that violence permeates both testaments, okay? We can also say that violence has permeated human history throughout its history, yes? And we are certainly awash in violence today, yes? Okay, on that happy note, let's turn to more specific texts. Okay, for those of you who were with me last year and remember, Psalm Laments, we spent some time on last time. And how many of you remember how many of the 150 Psalms in the Bible are lament Psalms? Give me a percentage. Give me a fraction. A tenth? A half? At least a third. Yes, okay. At least 50 of the 150 Psalms are Psalm Laments, yes? And yet we don't use them liturgically. We cut the bad parts out. Remember I talked about that last year? So I want to make the point, and as a way of review, to say that Psalm Laments are legitimate complaints in faith to God just at the time when we feel that God is absent. And they are therefore vehicles of honesty and expressions of our dependence upon God. We wouldn't take God to task and accuse God of sleeping on the job and say, please make those enemies' heads roll, if we didn't think that God cared enough to help us and had the power to put things right in the world, to foster justice, okay, and to punish the wicked. So the Psalms, I think, are vehicles of honest relationship with God, but they are saturated with violent metaphors that ought to give us pause. And if you want to read more, I wrote a book called Journey Through the Psalms, and I'm working on a new commentary for Liturgical Press called the Wisdom Commentary. And it's the first commentary in which there is an investigation of every book in the Bible from a feminist viewpoint. And that doesn't just mean white women. It means women of color all over the world. And it means men who also take a feminist viewpoint who argue that everyone is equal, male and female. And so there are issues of concern also about children, about economic structures, about family life, about political structures that oppress the marginalized. So it's, and I'm working with a woman from India. I'm working with a Korean woman. I'm working with a couple of African American students who are getting PhDs, and it's just a very exciting enterprise as we look at the entire Bible that way. Okay, so the problem is these violent metaphors, and this goes back to the title of what I'm doing with you tonight. Psalm 58, verses 6 through 8. And basically, in every lament, you normally get a section that talks about the enemies in the Psalms. And Psalm 58 is an 11-verse psalm that really focuses on the enemies. So in verse 6, the psalm says, "O God, break the teeth in their mouths, tear out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord." So the psalmist isn't asking for the power to do that himself or herself. The psalmist is saying, God, I'm turning these enemies over for you, make some heads roll. Let them vanish like water that runs away, like grass, let them be trodden down and wither. Let them be like the snail that dissolves into slime. I'm a gardener. I love that image because this area has a lot of slugs when it gets really humid, and I'm telling you, diatomaceous earth does not work. So I go out at 10 o'clock with a salt shaker, flip on the lights, and sprinkle the slugs, and they literally, their membranes burst because it causes them to retain fluid, and they literally dissolve into a pool of slime. I'm sorry, I'm hoping you didn't eat dinner too soon before this. So it's a very powerful image for me as a gardener, okay? What's your reaction to it? Yeah, ouch. Ouch, and this is what the psalmist is wishing for the enemy. So let me see if I have, let me stay here a minute. Let me ask you honestly, how many of you have felt that way at one point in your lives about someone or perhaps another group or another country? Have any of you ever felt that violent? I have. I definitely have. Yes?
We are from Pakistan, so we can imagine that every kind of violence.
Every what?
Every kind of violence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. So if we have never felt this way, I would say we have lived a very blessed and very, I would even venture to say maybe sheltered life. Or perhaps we took very seriously what Jesus said about praying for our enemies, right? Okay, love your enemies. My teacher, Walter Harrelson, always said, how do you command someone to love? You flip a switch? I don't think it's that easy. I would suggest that what we need to do first is fully articulate the hatred that we may hold for that person, so we can put it on the altar, give it over to God, and then maybe move toward love. But to turn a switch and say, stop hating, start loving, is something that I think is pretty difficult for us humans to do. Okay? We'll get back to some more of that in a minute. Psalm 137, verses 8 through 9, beautiful little children. And again, I'm thinking of drone strikes and civilians who have been killed in Pakistan and in other places in the world. O daughter Babylon, happy shall be they who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. That's in Psalm 137. How many of you know Sweet Honey in the Rocks by the Waters of Babylon? That beautiful psalm. I wish I had a better voice. It's a beautiful kind of mournful rhythm. They sing all the verses of Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Okay? But they leave out the end verses that are these. Okay? And that's not the whole, they do not tell the whole story by leaving these verses out. And that's, if you, again, as I said last year, if you look in your hymnals and look at hymns that are based on psalms, whenever a hymn is based on a lament psalm, the hymn will cut out the bad parts. Okay? And so we omit those verses in readings and hymns because, oh my goodness, who would take little ones' heads and dash them against the rock? We may not do that physically, but as I said last year, we have the technology that does it for us, and our hands are a little bit more clean, yes? So what do we do with violent rhetoric like that in the Psalm laments? Daniel Smith Christopher has written a book rather called Jonah, Jesus, and Other Good Coyotes. And a coyote is a reference to Mexicans who help immigrants sneak over our borders in the South, okay? And for the people who pay these coyotes, the coyotes are by and large heroes, except for the ones who cheat them, okay? Other people who are already in the States don't look so favorably upon the coyotes. And so for Daniel Smith Christopher, a coyote is always crossing boundaries, building bridges, leading people to new life. So he's challenging us to be coyotes as Christians. And I understand Flores has just done a new homeless ministry. You've really ramped that up, and you're increasing your ministry in Africa. I mean, you're doing some very exciting things. You're being good coyotes. You're crossing comfort zones. You're crossing boundaries. So he says that this kind of rhetoric that Israel is spouting is from a time when Israel was not actually capable of this level of violence against enemies, probably much of it from the Babylonian exile. In 587, the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, carried away the leadership to exile in Babylon, poisoned the wells, left the poorest of the poor back in the land to struggle, devastated Judah. Okay? And so when you are in that situation of having the stuffings knocked out of you, your rhetoric ramps up because it's the only thing you can use to kind of lash out and protect yourself. It's a natural human reaction. And it represents colonized people's dreams of rising up to destroy the colonizer. But if we haven't been colonized, we don't understand that. We censure that kind of language. And I think Smith Christopher would say we have to try harder to understand where that language comes from. And furthermore, he argues that it is reckless irresponsibility to take angry rhetoric literally and excuse genocide. In other words, if you are a nation of power and you decide that you are going to dash little ones' heads against the rocks, then you are misusing, you're misappropriating the language because it comes from oppressed and marginalized people. And so he has a laundry list of places in which we have taken that rhetoric out of context and used it as a warrant for destroying others. The Shoah, the Holocaust, Darfur, Armenia, Middle Passage, Rwanda, Bosnia. His book came out before a whole lot of the other stuff that's been going on. And we could certainly add to the list. Okay, New Testament. I promised you I would not let you off the hook with the New Testament. Let's talk about God's punishing violence in the New Testament. Here's a quote from John the Baptist, who is the forerunner of Jesus. He's announcing Jesus' coming. In Luke 3:17, he describes Jesus in this way. His winnowing fork is in his hand. What do you use a winnowing fork for? You throw the grain up in the air, the wind blows away the outer husk, and the heavier kernel falls down. And that kernel is what you use to bake with, right? You separate the wheat from the chaff, right? So for John the Baptist in Luke, Jesus comes with a winnowing fork in his hand to gather the wheat into his granary, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Ouch. Ouch. Okay? That's at the very beginning of the book of Luke. Does that fit into your picture of Jesus? It's there, but how conveniently we bracket it out. Okay? Jesus is going to make evil heads roll. The wicked will be punished, right? Galatians 6, God will not be mocked. You will reap what you sow. Okay? If you think about Jesus' parables, I mean, I could have gone through 10 parables here tonight. Many of Jesus' parables warn of violent ends for the wicked. And let me see if I have that one here. Yeah, the parable of the weeds in Matthew 13:42. Jesus declares that the weeds represent the children of the evil one who will be thrown by the angels into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What do you do when you gnash your teeth? Your jaw's clenched, you're grinding your teeth, right? You're in pain. This is punishment. That phrase, into the furnace of fire where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, is used 6 times more in the book of Matthew, in chapter 8, 13, twice in 13, chapter 22, chapter 24, chapter 25. The theme, the punishment of the wicked. Did you ever notice that in Matthew? No, we bracketed out. Jesus is not, not everybody is going to be saved, okay? Not everyone was healed. Not everyone is going to be saved. Not in these parable stories. Gnashing of teeth, weeping, because people will be punished. And then, let's see if we have this one. Yep. Yeah, fire, okay? In the apocalyptic book of Revelation, apocalyptic is wisdom notion of you get what you deserve, ratcheted up to a cosmic level. We read that anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Okay, fire is a very favorite means of punishment in the New Testament, okay? So I look at that and I say, ouch, ouch. This is an example, I think, of cosmic violence. And it is violence that God allows, that God actually institutes, carries out. Okay? Ooh, I can sense everybody's looking at me going, I'm not liking this very much. Any reactions so far? Are you surprised to just see this gather together in this way? It doesn't hit you as much when you see it here and there, right? But if you're concentrating on it, it's right in your face. It's hard to escape. Any comments on that? We are subdued. What?
Hard to process.
Hard to process. Hard to process. That's why we have 2 weeks. And you may come back and mug me. I don't know. But so that's just, we'll see. Okay.
So you're constantly struggling between the violence flooding up against grace.
Yes. Thank you. Well said. And that's a struggle that permeates the whole Bible. Because it's not a given that God won't forgive you, right? The wild card is God's grace. But it's not automatic. It's not automatic. And some people never get it. They are punished. They are consigned to the lake of fire. They are consigned to a place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But the wild card is always the grace. And that's true in Hebrew Bible as well. Hosea chapter 9. Hosea talks about, when Ephraim, which is Hosea's name for the northern kingdom of Israel, when Ephraim was a child, I took his hand and I led him through the wilderness and I taught him and I loved him, and then he went after other gods. And I am going to now put you in slavery again, not in Egypt this time, but with Assyria. And then at the end of that passage in Hosea 9, God says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? I am God and not human. I'm not going to destroy you. So God had every right, given a consequence, to say, you will be punished. And God at the last minute could not do that, okay? Because God loved Ephraim so much. So there's that grace, and it's always the tension. Those of us who are parents understand that really well, yes. Those of us who are siblings understand that very well. That's a human struggle as well as a divine struggle. Okay, thank you for that. That's a really helpful comment. Any other comments? Okay, let's see what else, other trouble we can get into. How can we interpret this violence? There is violence in the Bible, but we often exacerbate it. We often increase it exponentially by the way in which we interpret that violence. And again, we saw that with Daniel Smith Christopher and the Psalm 137 language. It comes from exile at a time when Israel couldn't carry this out if it wanted to. I call it venting. My kids are used to me, at the breakfast table looking at the Post. And they're coming downstairs. Well, they don't live with me anymore because they're on their own. But they come downstairs and they haven't had their coffee yet or their orange juice or their cereal. And I'll say, did you see that article on the front page of the Post? They say, Mom, please, I'm not even awake yet. Don't do that to me. So there are senses in which I needed to do that because I was so upset by what I read. So I was venting in a kind of violent way, and my kids got used to hearing that. So one helpful way of dealing with the violence in the Bible is to contextualize it, And we need to do that because what we are guilty of is often spiritualizing, sanitizing, avoiding, or neutralizing violence. It's as if we put blinders on and we say, do you remember Saturday Night Live? I forget what her name was, but she used to do na 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 na. Do you remember that? Any of you? When she didn't want to deal with something that was unpleasant. That's what we do when we read the Bible. We create our own canons within a canon. We read what we like, and we skip over the stuff we don't like, okay? So we spiritualize, sanitize, avoid, neutralize, and often use biblical violence to justify our own actions, and that's the real bad part. Excuse me. Oops. I'm going to go back just one second. So what we need to do is contextualize the violence and realize that in certain historical contexts, and this is what Daniel Smith Christopher did, the people who are oppressed vent their anger so that they can survive. The venting is a survival mechanism, okay? And Carol Saucy, a former colleague of mine at the seminary, has written, every surge of anger has a message to convey. A message about oneself, about relationships, about hopes and dreams, about social justice, about the lure of God in one's life. Every surge of anger has a message. The Israelites in 137 do not carry out the wished-for violence, and that context of theirs in exile challenges those who use Psalm 137 to justify their own pursuit of genocide. Okay, we ought to really stop and think about that. Hold on one second and let me see. I think these are out of order. No, they're not. Okay. All right. Other readers spiritualize the Bible with allegorical or typological interpretations. So instead of talking about actual people, a text will become an allegory of Christ in the church, or we sometimes leave out disturbing parts as discussed in connection with Psalm 137. And how many of you have seen Gideon Bibles in hotel rooms? What do they leave out? All of the Old Testament except for the Psalms. Yeah, okay, so there is selective reading going on there that allows people to cut out parts that they don't like. The Revised Common Lectionary also cuts and pastes. Do you use the Revised Common Lectionary at Flores? Do you know? Your scripture passages every week? You don't? Okay. That's good, because the Revised Common Lectionary, for instance, when it comes to the book of Lamentations, what is Lamentations? Does anybody know when it was written? Does anybody know what it's about? What? The tradition is that it's written by Jeremiah because Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet, and there's a lot of crying that goes on in Lamentations. We think that Jeremiah actually didn't write it, but it's in the spirit of Jeremiah, and it laments the destruction of Jerusalem. And it is a thoroughly sad 5 chapters that is read on the 9th of Av, which is in August in the Jewish calendar, to remember the destruction of the temple. So the book of Lamentations, 5 chapters, is saturated with grief and doubt and anger and questions about God because of the violent destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So you get verses like 2:2, God has destroyed without mercy, or 2:5, God has become like an enemy, or in chapter 1, several verses, Jerusalem is in despair with no one to comfort her. It's a refrain. Jerusalem is like a widow sitting lonely with no one to comfort her, over and over and over again. And the book ends at the end of chapter 5 with a plea and a question. Restore us to yourself, O Lord, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. That's how the book ends. It's cliffhanger. And God never speaks in the book of Lamentations. God never says a word. Why do you think that is? Think about that. It's the only book in the Bible where God does not speak. Lamentations filled with anger and doubt and grief. Stories of mothers boiling their own children because people are starving to death.
Well, wouldn't it be because it's God's absence that is fueling the
Yeah, that's one possibility. That's a good possibility. All of these questions and all of this anguish come from God's perceived absence. You let the stuffings get knocked out of us. And so it's almost as if God can't show God's face. Yeah, okay? I'm pushing that a little bit. You may not want to go there, but it's almost a logical conclusion. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Any other reason why God would not speak?
Well, through the prophets, he's warned them repeatedly that there were consequences.
Okay, so God has already said what God needed to say, nothing else to say. I told you this was going to happen. I sent you the prophets. You didn't listen. So I'm done. I can't say anything. But that's a pretty cold God. Yeah? What's it from a pastoral viewpoint? When you're with someone who's really hurting or someone who's dying, someone who's grieving, is it always good to speak too much? Listen. You want to honor people with your presence, right? Sometimes words are not adequate. So one could say that God doesn't speak because there is nothing God can say to take away that pain. And I'm reminded of what incident in the book of Job. Remember Job's 3 friends when they first learn about his losses, his grave losses? What do? They listen. At the end of chapter 2, the news comes to them. They set out immediately to go to him. They see him from far off. They don't even recognize him. And they tear their clothes. They throw dust on their head, which mimics what Job had already done earlier in chapter 1. Okay, so mimicking what he does is a way of showing solidarity with him. And they sat in silence for how many days and nights? Remember? 7. 7, good Bible readers. 7, okay? That's a pastoral gift to shut up and be present, because sometimes there's nothing you can say to make sense of the grief and the chaos that someone's experiencing. And I think, to kind of twist what you said, God can't say anything because the pain is too great of the people. I mean, yes, granted, God warned them, but how many times have we warned our children not to do something? And what do? They do exactly what we warned them not to do, right?
So he didn't say, I told you so.
He did, right. God did not say, which is important. God did not say, I told you so. God simply allowed the people to vent their grief because they needed it to survive. Trauma studies now are showing that trauma is so devastating that it's like pieces of broken glass, shards, that will pop up and just cut people anew. And all of order, of what is known, gets scrambled and jumbled. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like to live in a bombed-out city, to live in Lebanon, which has been bombed how many times, to live in places in Afghanistan and Pakistan that have been bombed. And the trauma of that, day in and day out, my goodness, My goodness. We don't know what that's like, most of us, okay? So there are ways that we can avoid being problematic in our interpretation. We can contextualize and see what historical a situation has produced that language. We can note what is said and what is not said. So going back to the lectionary again, do you know what the one text is that the lectionary chose from the 5 chapters of the book of Lamentations that's all about grief and pain and questioning? The middle section in chapter 3, which cannot stand alone, that is all about hope. So if you go to Lamentations, which does come after the book of Jeremiah, and chapter 3, and you're going to recognize this as soon as I say it, 22 through 24. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Do you know that hymn? Great is thy faithfulness, right? Right? The Lord is my portion, says my being, therefore I will hope in him. That's what the lectionary plucked out of Lamentations. That text. That kind of hope cannot stand alone. It is bracketed in the book of Lamentations by the opening, how lonely sits the widow Jerusalem with no one to comfort her, and the ending question about, restore us to yourself, O Lord, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. And what does the lectionary pluck out? Great is thy faithfulness. Wow, that is a misinterpretation of the book of Lamentations. It does not give pain its due. It does not give protest its due. It is cheating. It is cheap. It makes me angry. Makes me angry. Let's see, what's this one? Oh, no, we're not there yet. Okay. What about the David and Bathsheba story? Okay, what about the David and Bathsheba story? Would you call that a violent story? Why? What is violent about it? No, yes. Who's Bathsheba's husband? Uriah. How does he have Uriah killed? He not only does he have him killed, he gives the orders to Joab, his general, to Uriah to carry to Joab, the general. So basically, Uriah is carrying his own death sentence. Okay? Nasty. And basically, the orders are put Uriah in the front lines, and when he's there in the most vulnerable position, pull the troops back so he's totally exposed. And guess what? He died. Okay? So he had Uriah murdered. All right? Why did he have Uriah murdered? This is 2 Samuel 11 and 12. He wanted Bathsheba. And what was the problem with Bathsheba at the time? She was pregnant. Whose baby was it? How do we know that? Yeah, okay, Uriah was at battle, and when David got together with Bathsheba, she came back and said, I'm pregnant. What was the first thing that David did? Called Uriah and said, come home for some R&R. Go down and be with Bathsheba, right? Because he figured, he was home for some R&R, and then when she's pregnant, people say, it must have happened when Uriah was home from the front. What did Uriah do instead? He wouldn't go down to his house. He slept outside the palace of the king with the rest of the soldiers, right? Because he said, my men are out there in the field. How can I relax with my wife in my home when they're so exposed, right? And then what did David do to Uriah? Got him drunk, thinking, okay, now the power of suggestion will work. Go down to your house. Uriah still slept outside the palace, right? And so the third step was to have him killed, all right? So the violence is in the murder of Uriah. What is the violence vis-a-vis Bathsheba? Excuse me? Thank you. She was violated. I go so far as to say she was raped. And I've had both men and women in my classes say, she could have said no. And I said, in what universe? In what universe, particularly in that culture in which absolute obedience was owed to the king who had a harem. He had several wives and a large harem, okay? And what might happen to Uriah, her husband, if she said no? Wouldn't there be repercussions for him? Remember, he's a Hittite. He's a foreigner, right? And so he's in David's special guard. Would he have kept that position? Do you think, if she had said no? I've had military people in my classes. I've taught military chaplains several times. Fabulous, incredible jobs that they do. I'm in awe of the line that they have to navigate. And they have told me some of them actually ended marriages because they were deployed and their wives were home on base. These were all men. I think there could be other stories the other way because there are women who serve. The commander of the base post approached her and said, you will submit to me or your husband is going to be deployed for a long time. You know? So it's not only ancient culture, it's our culture too. Okay? So there's coerciveness, there's violence in what David did to Bathsheba. Also reinforced by the language of the text. In 2 Samuel 11, if you have your Bibles, I forgot mine, I had to borrow Bill's. Don't tell, okay? But mine's buried on my desk with all my writing, so I think I have some excuse. I didn't want to extract it. 2 Samuel 11. David's up on his roof, and of course the beginning of 2 Samuel 11 says, in the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent, he does a lot of sending, a lot of power over. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, which is the capital of Ammon. But David remained at Jerusalem. What is the narrator telling you? I love Hebrew Bible stories because they don't tell you what to think. They just describe what's happening, and you get drawn in and you start drawing your own conclusions. What does the narrator mean when the narrator says, but David stayed in Jerusalem? Yeah, he wasn't the head of the troops. He's supposed to be off at war, so he's already doing what he's not supposed to be doing, right? And that's like a little signal from the narrator saying, uh-oh, there's going to be trouble here, okay? Everybody else is gone. You do it in the spring because it rains in the winter and your equipment will get bogged down. It's too hot in the summer. There's not enough water. You can't do it in the fall because that's the olive and the grape harvest. So spring is the time you do it, okay? He should have been at battle. He did not go. All right? And then immediately the text says, it happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking back and forth. The translation doesn't do the verb in Hebrew justice. Hitalek, walking back and forth on the roof of the king's house. He was pacing. What does that tell you? Restless. He's not getting out that testosterone on the battlefield. So where's it going to go? Okay, again, a little signal from the narrator. And he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. What's the narrator saying? Here, I really hate the narrator because the narrator is basically saying, oh, boys are going to be boys, right? I have a daughter, and a son, and yeah. So David sent someone to inquire about the woman. It was reported, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Sheva. So David sent messengers to get her. Sent messengers to get her. Now, when I say to my son, Brian, go get your sister for dinner, how might he approach his sister and tell her dinner's ready? Yeah, yell up the stairs, but say, come on, dinner's ready, right? It's kind of an invitation. He sent messengers to get her. Oh, excuse me, Miss Bathsheba, but would you mind coming to the king's palace? Do you know what the Hebrew verb is that gets translated get? Lakach. It means to take. He sent messengers to take her. Does that sound like a different story? What does the taking mean? That's the violation. That's the rape, right? And look at how we spiritualize, sanitize, avoid what's really going on in that story just by the translation that we choose. Every translation is an interpretation. Every time you read Scripture, you're interpreting Scripture, right? Because you're going to decide if you're going to shout it, if you're going to whisper it, if you're going to pause, if you're going to go fast, if you're going to say it angry, right? And when you make those decisions, you're already interpreting the text, aren't you? The Bible does not come with stage directions. You provide them. So look at how complicated this whole interpretation process is, right? And so if I were reading this with the Hebrew, the proper Hebrew translation, so then David sent messengers to take her. Not, oh, and then David sent messengers to get her. You have such a responsibility if you read Scripture from the pulpit. You really need to do your homework about how to read it and where the inflections go, because that's part of the story. So to take her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, which is a phrase in Hebrew Bible that means have sexual relations oftentimes. And then in parentheses, which don't exist in Hebrew, now she was purifying herself after her period. Why do we need to know that? Why is that in there? Because narratives don't add information we don't need. They're very terse, they're very concise, they tell us only what the narrator thinks we need to know. Why do we need to know that she was purifying herself when he first saw her bathing? It means that any fertilized egg has been washed away by her menstrual cycle. And so without telling us directly and the baby was David's, we put two and two together, get pulled into the story, so when she announces I'm pregnant, we say it's got to be David's, right? See how you've just been sucked into the story, right? Okay, so violence on two levels, the murder of Uriah, the rape of Bathsheba. But what do we do with this story? Well, Bruce Birch in the New Interpreter's Bible says we either scapegoat Bathsheba as seductress or co-conspirator, and I wish I had the movie clip that I could show you from, it's called King David, and Richard Gere is King David, and I don't know who the actress is who plays Bathsheba, but he has her brought to the palace, and then he asks her about Uriah and how long they've been together. And she says, he only touches me with a whip. In other words, she's an abused wife. She's beaten. Tell me where in that story it says that, okay? Okay? And then he said, and you have no children? She said, no, he only touches me with the whip, Where are the children that I'm supposed to have? And he said, you shall have them. And she looks up at him and says, not while I'm married. Okay? Meaning, okay, put two and two together, David, knock off my husband, then I won't be married, then we can have children, right? Tell me where that is it's not there. But that movie was very popular. It came out in 1985, and that's what people know of the David and Bathsheba story. And then rationalizing David's actions by arguing that Uriah was an abusive husband, which King David does, and also David and Bathsheba, the Gregory Peck, Rita Hayworth 1955 movie. How many of you have seen that? In my classes, I show clips from both of those. And oh my God, Gregory Peck and Rita Hayworth, they are pledging love to one another and talking about how she understands a leader, and he's talking about the blood of Semitic men and how it boils, and she's just gazing up at him with those eyes. Oh, I've cued the violins. It's just, it's amazing. Amazing. And what that does is number 3, it romanticizes the text as a great love story. And in that Rita Hayworth, Gregory Peck 50s movie, she says to him, I watched you every day pacing. I watched you every day. And, and oh, my king and my lord, and oh, my goodness. Okay? Great, great, great love story. So what do we do to this story of violence? We scapegoat Bathsheba as seductress. And in fact, in the David and Bathsheba movie with Richard Gere from '85, she is bathing outside and she looks up at him to make sure that he sees her, bathing naked. And then people say, why is she bathing outside? She did that on purpose to lure him. Well, let me tell you, in the ancient world, there was no indoor plumbing. The water was outside in the courtyard, right? And should David have seen her? Where was he supposed to have been? At war. So she could have done that with no problem. She lived near the palace because her husband Uriah had a highly important job, so he got some good real estate out of it, okay? But she could have done that with impunity because David should not have been there. So no indoor plumbing. The water's outside. That's where the animals are watered. That's where people shower. That's where things are cooked. Okay? So get your, Southern Living magazine house out of your head. All right? So let's not sanitize the story. Let's not put blinders on by looking at the violence in the story. Let me see. No, we're still not ready for that. Sorry. Okay, another story in 2 Kings 5. I don't think many people know this story. 2 Kings 5, if you have a Bible. Do you know the story about Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, who was a mighty warrior and suffered from leprosy? Do you remember that story? This is the time of Elisha and Elisha, the prophets. The Syrians had warred, they had raided other lands, and they'd taken captives. That's what you do. You get booty from war. You take the spoils of war, which would include animals and slaves. And the slaves would be men, women, and children. And in one of the raids, Naaman had taken a captive from the land of Israel, a young girl. And she was the serving girl for Naaman's wife. And she said to her mistress, if only my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria, meaning, Elisha. He would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his Lord just what the girl from the land of Israel had said. And the king of Aram said, go then, and I will send along a letter to the king of Israel. So we get this beautiful little story of the slave girl who wants to take care of her master, who plucked her from her family as a slave. Okay? How does that sit with you? Does that? So when interpreters look at what she says, they want to hold her up as a model of reconciliation and of love that conquers hate. She does God's work quietly on the margins. She sees possibilities when no one else does. I wrote an exegesis of this for Good Preacher, and I just couldn't believe what I was reading from interpreters who didn't want to see anything bad in the story, okay? They said that she heals the broken in the midst of war and death. She brings hope that things can be better for everyone. She chooses to love and not hate. She is a young girl who has been torn from her family, taken to a foreign country, and forced into service of a foreign woman. Are any of you capable of making that kind of transition to choosing love and not hate? Is this an idealization of this poor little girl? Please say yes. And the thing is, they're not reading this story. It's filled with irony and reversals. And what we have is the voice of this little slave girl that has been co-opted by people in exile to make a theological point about God's sovereignty that they want to hear. Okay? They're in exile. Babylon has kicked the stuffings out of them. But God is the universal sovereign God over everyone and can even heal a Syrian commander. And I want to say, enough of that. That slave girl is a traumatized spoil of war, like women and children through the ages, and that the brutality of war often kills hope. And if we can't see that, then we will continue to wage war and put women, children, and men through this trauma again and again and again. But that sanitizing I simply could not stand still for. So my article was basically get a grip, people, and read this from the context of what actually happened to that little girl. Okay, so that brings us to, finally, Eric Seibert, who wrote a book called The Violence of Scripture. Excellent book. Excellent book. He's done a lot of work on violence in Scripture. And he talks about compliant readings that we all do. And he basically calls compliant reading a default mode of reading the Bible. In other words, we are predisposed to come to the Bible and wrench everything positive out of it that we can to make ourselves feel good and to build up this God whom we worship. Yes? I'm being very blunt here, but he is also blunt in this book. We read the Bible with trust and exceptions. We adopt the Bible's values without questions, and we say that these are God's values. And Seibert says, quote unquote, this is the default mode of readers who grew up in the church. I grew up in the church. That is a major criticism of agnostics and atheists. They say, we cannot worship this violent God of yours. And we can't say this violent God only exists in Hebrew Bible because we've seen plenty of evidence of that God also existing in the New Testament. So what do? We dumb down, we ignore, we spiritualize, we sanitize, we romanticize. Okay, that will not do. And as the church shrinks, unless we confront honest questions with some honest answers and some really clear looks, we're not helping to spread the good news. We really are not. Thank you for that. Very well said. So the compliant reader is the one who sees this. I love this. This is Barbara Reed's 2x2. It's her artist's rendering of Noah's Ark. It's like the one I have outside my kids' bedrooms. Okay, all the little fuzzy creatures and the beautiful birds and just all these boisterous animals. Doesn't it make you smile? Right? That's a compliant reading of the flood story. And on the other hand, the conversant reader, let me see if that slide is there, and I'll come back. A conversant reading from Eric Seibert is a reading that critically evaluates what we're reading. It is a resistant reading. It says, I'm not going to just lie down and just go for the positive like I've been taught since I was knee-high, but I'm going to look more deeply into what's going on here. It's a reading from what I would call outside the ark, okay? Not from the viewpoint of those who made it in, but from the viewpoint of those who did not make it in, okay? And a conversant reader actively engages the biblical text and critically evaluates it. And that reader accepts what can be accepted and resists what must be resisted in the text. And that means that this is an active rather than a passive interpretation. And a person who does that same kind of conversant reading is Renita Weems, great African-American Bible scholar who has written a book called Battered Love. It's a story of sex and violence in the prophets. And she said, we have to read the prophets as conversant readers, to use Seibert's terms, because the prophets are always talking about the relationship between God and Israel as what kind of relationship? What metaphor do they use often to describe the God-Israel relationship? Yeah, bride and bridegroom. It's a marriage. Covenant is a marriage. Who's the bridegroom? God. Who's the bride? Israel. What kind of bride is she? For the prophets. Unfaithful. She is running after other gods all the time. She is an unfaithful bride, and God has the right to punish her, to divorce her, to make her suffer. And if you read Hosea 2, whoa, yeah. Hosea is the stand-in for God, and his wife Gomer is the stand-in for Israel. And there's language in there about stripping her naked and humiliating her and not letting her go out of the house and denying her food, humiliating her children. Typical abuse. If any of you have worked in abuse shelters, typical cycles of abuse in chapter 2 of Hosea. And Renita Weems looks at those and says that the violent marriage metaphors expressing the God-Israel relationship warn us to be prepared to resist, to avoid, to maneuver around some of the counterproductive impulses within the texts. Those are her words. She said, we cannot surrender to these texts because what do? They can perpetuate on a human level domestic violence. Okay? So let's go back to this flood story with conversant and compliant readings. Barbara reads 2 by 2 was a compliant reading. Conversant reading, I don't know how clearly you can see this. This is Gustave Doré. This is called the deluge. Can you see what's happening on that rock and around the rock? What do you see? Drowning. Who's drowning? People, men, women, and children. And in fact, in the lower right corner, that's the body of a little child that is already dead. By the way, I just saw All Is Lost with Robert Redford. Oh, what a cheesy ending. You know, there's ambiguity there. Did he really drown or not? Oh, I'm so, yeah, not pleased. Not pleased. So is that the view from outside the ark? Did these people make it inside the ark? No. I show this slide to my intro class, and they gasp. Back to back. Barbara reads 2 by 2, and then flip. Okay, that was inside the ark. Let's look outside the ark. Think about all the people who died in the flood. What constitutes justice? What is love? What is tough love? How does grace figure in mercy? How do the workings of the Spirit figure into this equation? I always call the Holy Spirit God's wild card. Okay? There is the danger of positing a formula that says, okay, I gave you this many years, you haven't shaped up, you're done. But how many of us would like to go before God's throne right now and say, judge me right now on my merits, and wouldn't want a little God's grace thrown in that judgment? Okay? So what you say is correct, but are we pegging God to some kind of formula that says this must happen when we read again and again in the Bible that God will reverse the punishment, change God's mind? And in fact, even in the Genesis 6 narrative itself, it says in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and this supports what you said, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. I mean, that sentence, that verse says clearly, these people are hopeless, okay? Which is a justification for God to do what God does. And then in verse 6, the NRSV says, and the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth. Basically, the translation is the Lord changed the Lord's mind about making humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart, okay? Now, that is very upsetting, that verse, for a lot of my students, because they have, and there's a slide I have later that talks about core testimony. Walter Brueggemann, in his Theology of the Old Testament, talks about core and counter testimony, and I don't know if you remember my talking about that last year. Core testimony is what we want to believe is true of God all of the time. And normally it involves the great verbs of things that God does. So if you want to affirm who God is for you, what would you say about God? What does God do? Love. God loves. What else does God do? God is gracious, provides grace. Yes, what else? Forgives. Ooh, isn't that a major characteristic of God? Okay, but according to, formulas that say, I warned you and I warned you and I warned you and you're still not getting it, forgiveness is no longer possible. Okay, what else can we say about God? Patient. God is patient. What else? God is faithful.
He's slow to anger, but finally he'll get angry.
Slow to anger. Okay, and is a God of justice. So we could say a major component is God is just. Okay, what else? How about God creates? God is all-powerful. Some people say God is all-knowing. I don't think the Bible supports that. And there are lots of the rabbis have a saying, all is foreseen, but freedom is given. It's in the Talmud, which is the Jewish interpretation of Hebrew Bible. And that means that God knows every possibility of what we might do, but does not ultimately know exactly which among those possibilities we will choose. And then God waits for us to make the choice, and then God reacts appropriately to the choice. Look at what kind of dynamic relationship that is. This is not God the unmoved mover, okay? So what other core testimony might we give about God? God judges. God rules. The enthronement psalms that we say in Easter. The Lord reigns, right? What else? Gentle. God is gentle, loving, kind. Okay, counter testimony is what we're not very comfortable with. Counter testimony is what we get from our conversant readings, not the compliant readings. I would say the compliant readings of Scripture fuel core testimony about God. Okay? That's our default mode. We want to say positive things about God. Conversant readings fuel counter testimony that comes out of lived experience and says, I'm not experiencing God as all those things you just listed in the core testimony. Okay? God is not present, but God is absent. God is not forgiving, but God is angry. Okay? God is not loving, but God is punishing. Okay? What?
Not patient.
Not patient, right.
And he's a jealous God.
A jealous God, which I think actually in the Hebrew, that's a phrase in Deuteronomy 5, it ought to be translated, God is a passionate God. Because jealous has such negative connotations, but passion can be both positive and negative. And when my students ask me, what do you think is the tie that runs throughout the whole Bible? And for me, it's God passionately desires relationship with us. And that passion has both a positive and a negative pole. So I think, given the semantic range of that word, passion is a better translation. But, okay, so counter-testimony is really what you were talking about before. There's always a kind of butting together or butting against one another of the core versus the counter-testimony in our experience, right? Wouldn't it be lovely if we were in core testimony all the time? Yeah? But a lot of people live in counter-testimony, and especially people in marginalized areas of our own communities and in the world, in oppressed areas of the world, okay? So again, we're back to the tension. And one of the things my students laugh at, my favorite word is tension. Surprise, okay? The Bible is not a systematic theology. The Bible is different glimpses of who God is, and often they're in tension with one another, even within the same book. Jeremiah's got about 6 or 7 different views of who God is, and they clash with one another, okay? So let's explore this a little bit more, and then I'm going to have you kind of turn to one another in a minute and talk some things over. So the compliant reading that we see in children's nurseries, in paintings, puzzles, toys, depicting Noah's Ark, filled with cuddly, colorful animals, filing happily into the ark 2 by 2, That is a reading that's compliant from the inside of the ark with no thought of those who never made it on board. And Seibert calls that God's virtuous violence. God's virtuous violence supports a compliant reading. So the Lord said, I will blot out the earth from the earth, the human beings I have created, for I changed my mind about making them. That's the verse I read from Genesis 6, verse 7. So God gets very violent, and we can say, well, there's a reason for that. Okay? People were evil continually. And as you said, God gave them plenty of heads up, and they didn't get it, and so now it's tough. My patience is gone. Okay? So God is supported in carrying out this violence, in doing this, as Durer has depicted it, right? So we make God's violence virtuous. God's violence is warranted because the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth. Verse 5. Virtuous violence, says Seibert, can normalize violence and desensitize us to violence. We don't even question it anymore. And a radically different conversant reading is designated by this Doré engraving. And that engraving comes from 1866. And there is, I know you can't see it from where you are, but there's a tiger and a human couple desperately attempting to save their drowning offspring, the tiger and the human offspring, by seeking refuge on a rock in the swirling waters. So not only humans, but the animal kingdom, they're suffering too with the flood. This is a reading from outside the ark that critiques the violence of the flood. Does that make sense? Okay. And then, as I suggested before, actually, Michael and I in our book, Grounded in the Living Word, talk about 3 levels of listening. Not only to the text, but to one another in pastoral encounters. We talk about consonant listening that recognizes agreements. Okay, that's the compliant reading that Seibert talks about. The danger is we see what we want to see what makes us comfortable. Okay? Dissonant listening recognizes disagreements. And the danger with that is when we see the disagreement, our tendency is to be overwhelmed by it and to shut down. You know, as you said, I'm chewing on this. This is disturbing. I don't know what to make of it. I'm going to protect myself. What we advocate is harmonious listening that recognizes both the agreement and the disagreement. In other words, helps us to live with the tension. And I don't know if in biblical studies we're at the point yet where we can bring compliant and conversant readings together. They're still at loggerheads with one another. Okay? So let's see. One more thing I wanted to say about core encounter testimony. In terms of the liturgical year for Christians, what is the event in our liturgical year that epitomizes core testimony about who God is? What is the one thing that we celebrate as the rock solid foundation of our faith? Easter, the resurrection, right? The resurrection is all about hope. It's all about core testimony. It's about God reigns, God lives, right? But what has to come before the resurrection? The crucifixion and Good Friday. Think about attendance at this church on Good Friday versus Easter. Which is more highly attended? Easter, in every church I know. In every church I know. Good Friday is the core testimony. How can God's Son die on a cross? Okay? That certainly rocked the world of the disciples who couldn't even hang around. It was the women who were there, right? So even in our liturgical year and in Jesus' life and ministry and death and resurrection, you get the poles of core encounter testimony and the tension of that in our Christian lives. And there is a dissonance there that we need to recognize. Let's see. All right, we're going to come to our small group work. I'm going to set it up with Dana Fuel, who I think is a wonderful, wonderful Hebrew Bible scholar. If you read anything by her, she's terrific. She wrote a book called The Children of Israel in 2003. And she wants to read the whole Bible from the viewpoint of children because they're marginalized, basically, in the text. I mean, you mentioned earlier the massacre of the innocents, and Moses was born in a very dangerous situation. There was a decree from Pharaoh that all of the firstborn children, all of the boys, would be thrown into the Nile. And Herod's decree made Jesus' birth very dangerous, right? They share that endangered birth. Just like Romulus and Remus and Sargon of Akkad. I mean, that's a story that has persisted through the millennia, okay? Because it's all about showing God's divine providence and the workings of the leadership of these endangered babies. So Dana wants to read the Hebrew Bible from the viewpoint of children. And she says we need to develop a strategy of stopping and questioning the text, especially when it comes to violence against children. We cannot read passively because the text is addressing us and we bear some responsibility for what's going on in that text. We need to stop and question the text and recognize that ethically something is amiss, something's wrong in what we're being told. Interruption as a reading mechanism recognizes the blurring of boundaries between the biblical texts and our lives and provides us with another more responsible alternative. And when we stop and question the text, we're actually creating an ethical moment in which we can imagine both the story told differently and our lives lived differently because we told the story differently. That's really powerful. And that means that we have to be engaged in the text and that we have to interrupt harmonious listening. And she draws on Levinas, who talks about the text as a school, a living space of faces related to us. And I look at the Bible as a living space of faces that are related to us. If you're face to face with someone, don't you owe them a really rapt listening and attentive listening? Don't you owe them that ethical moment that says, wait a minute, that's not right? Don't we? Don't we? Now, coming face to face doesn't always solve the problem of violence. My colleague Michael tells a story of living in Silver Spring, and there's this one-lane road with a little bridge over a creek, and you have to wait for, the cars coming in each direction kind of have to decide who has the right of way. Well, he encountered a car that wouldn't back up, and Michael wouldn't back up, so there they are face to face, and no one was moving. Okay, so face-to-face encounters don't always solve things. Sometimes you get stuck in a face-off. So I'm not saying that this is some kind of panacea for what ails us. Okay. Nope. So, one thing we can do when we're reading the text with one another or we're in a pastoral situation with one another, we can practice the art of interruption. We can say, wait a minute, ethical moment here, something's wrong, we've got to question this. We need to be open to regular disruption from the questions that other people ask. And when you look at our talk shows and our news shows, would you say that those commentators are open to questions that other people ask? Are they about creating ethical moments, or are they about shouting at one another? And I don't care which one we're talking about, on the right or left or center, they all do it. They all do it, and I'm personally sick of it because what I'm talking about can't happen in that kind of space. It's a hostile space. We need to be able to be dislodged and dislocated by the perspectives and questions from another field, from another experience, from another person. And Most importantly, we need to be willing to dwell in the disruption for a while before retreating to what is comfortable. You know, and we all like to be comfortable, and we don't want the messiness. But you know what? We live in messiness. We need to learn to deal with it better. We need to be with it for a while. How might you rename the flood story?
What story?
The flood story, Genesis 6 through 9.
Around the world.
The day God drowned the world.
It sounds like a movie. Good job. Yeah.
Okay. All right, is that a conversant title or a compliant title? Conversant. It's looking at the story from those outside the ark, yes? Right? Yeah, definitely. All right, any other titles for the flood story?
I came up with God's wrath against the world.
God's wrath against the world. Similar, right. Again, conversant or compliant? Conversant. It's reading with interruption. It's saying, what about all those other people who are not in the ark? Ooh, outside looking in. Nice. Oh, nice. Yeah. Outside looking in. Starting over. Yeah. Starting over. But look at how that just puts the story in such a different perspective. I mean, one of the problems with Bible interpretation is we think we know the Bible stories so well that they cease to register with us because we think we have them all figured out. And these titles basically reframe them for us and help us get at them from another angle. Any other renamings of the flood story?
She said
God rules. Okay, and that's ambiguous. What does that ruling mean? Okay, that gives us some room to really poke around in there. Yeah, absolutely. What else?
A righteous and decent man and his family live, and everybody else dies.
Oh, yes, did y'all hear that? A righteous and decent man and his family live, but everyone else dies. Okay. Any other ones for that particular story? What? All what? The ark is the grace of God. Is that a compliant or a conversant reading? Okay, again, it depends on where you stand, but I'm hearing a lot of people say compliant. Interesting. Okay.
It could be compliant if somebody is, if two school of thoughts are there, they are both extreme school of thoughts, then it could be compliant. And for the other people, it could be conversion.
Right.
There are no right and wrong answers.
Absolutely not. It depends on where you stand, doesn't it? Yep. And it depends on what core testimony you bring to that text. What is it that you believe about God? It frames the way you're going to title the story, right? Absolutely.
In fact, you have to be very cautious because now we're doing the same thing as we criticize the clients.
Right. And that was my comment that we need now to find a way to bring the compliant and the conversant right up against one another. And maybe we can't resolve the tension, but let's just say, oh, let's put this next to this and look. And just as I said before, be with it for a while before we try to smooth it over. Okay?
So it means that we can politically correct Bible, like politicians are doing. They are doing the political correctness all the time. So we can bring these two thoughts together and make something which is kind of a digest and politically correct.
Right. And I don't want to do that. I want each part to kind of have its own voice, and I want us to live in the tension. Okay? I think politically correct on whichever side, right or left, you're operating, opts for one or the other, and I want both of them to get their due and to be recognized as in tension with one another. That's what I'm pushing for. Okay? All right, so think about that. What about the David and Bathsheba story? How would you rename that?
King rapes neighbor, kills husband, God forgives.
be a country song. That's a country song right there.
Did y'all hear that?
Left out film at 11.
Did y'all hear that? Say it again, louder.
Okay. King rapes neighbor, kills husband. God forgives. Bill Phillips.
Okay.
We were trying to think like Washington Post.
Yes, right. Okay. You know, Don,
That's the reason you get angry when you read the Post, because that kind
I get angry when I see every newscast except for maybe the BBC.
David and Bathsheba has no problem.
I'm sorry?
For me, the names are quite okay. I mean, they are telling the story and they wanted to read about it. But if you have to be very sarcastic or very satirical about it, then I can always say tit for tat.
Oh, tit for tat. Yes. Do we have any other titles for David and Bathsheba?
Good King David, rapist and murderer.
Oh.
Man steals another man's wife.
Okay. Well, okay. Good King David,
Rapist and murderer.
rapist and murderer. I like that because it juxtaposes the compliant with the conversant. Nice. And I'm sorry, say yours again. Oop. Oh,
I said, a lecherous old man steals another man's wife.
a lecherous old man steals another man's wife. Yeah, and that's even bracketing out the murder of, yeah. Okay. Anything else?
We can call it from consensus, when both parties are agree and they did what Bathsheba and David did. It was consensus, sex or whatever, because both agreed. We are looking at the story from one point of it, or if Bathsheba would have disagreed, then what would have happened? But she never disagreed. She did what she was supposed to do, and the presidents and everybody, we say that it happened at that time. It is still happening.
Yes,
This
it-
is the 21st century too.
Absolutely.
All under the microscope of press.
Yes.
Presidents are still doing what David was doing at that time.
Vive la France. Vive la France. Yes, it just happened in France. That was a little brush up there. Yes. These themes are universal human themes. That's why these stories still grab us. Did anybody have a chance to think about the book of Revelation? Didn't go there. Okay. All right. So, what? The beginning of the end. Yeah, the beginning of the end for some.
Or we can say time over.
Time over, right, time over, yeah. Yeah, so think about stories in the Bible that you know that could benefit from a renaming with an eye toward conversant and compliant readings. And next week, we're going to look at some more stories, particularly the story of Rahab in Joshua 2. So if you want to read that ahead of time, you can do that. I have lots to say about Rahab. And also, we're going to be looking at the book of Jeremiah. Okay? So if you want to do some reading ahead, you can do that. But we're going to persist with this theme of compliant, conversant, with looking at divine violence and human violence. If you read Joshua 2, read also Joshua 6, because it's the end of the Rahab story. Okay? All right, so thank you for coming, and keep thinking about those new titles, okay? All right.